There exists within every human being a truth so vast that most spend entire lifetimes never touching its surface. This truth is not hidden in ancient temples or guarded by spiritual gatekeepers. It lives quietly in the very center of consciousness itself, waiting to be recognized. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this truth is stated with absolute clarity. Divinity is not something distant or external. It is the very essence of what every person already is. Yet most walk through life as if they were small, powerless, and ordinary. What causes someone to carry infinite creative power yet live as if they were helpless? The answer lies not in lack of potential, but in lack of awareness. Society teaches limitation from the earliest years. It trains people to see themselves as separate from the source of all creation. In doing so, it creates a world where individuals believe they must beg, struggle, and hope for change from forces outside themselves. But what if the entire premise was false? What if the power to reshape reality was never outside but always within? This is not motivational philosophy or comforting belief. This is the fundamental structure of existence as revealed through both spiritual wisdom and emerging science. Bruce Lipton's research in epigenetics demonstrates that consciousness directly influences biological reality at the cellular level. The environment does not control the cell, perception of the environment does. In the same way, the external world does not control a person's life. The internal state of consciousness does. When this understanding finally takes root, everything changes. Most people live trapped in a paradox. They sense something greater within themselves but act from a place of smallness. They feel the pull of divinity but answer with doubt. They carry the creative power of the infinite but use it unconsciously to recreate the same limiting patterns over and over. Why does this happen? Because they have been conditioned to worship gods outside themselves while ignoring the God that breathes through their very being. The lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard reveal this ancient deception with stunning clarity. Imagine carrying a treasure of unimaginable worth but walking through life as a beggar. That is the human condition for most. Not because the treasure is absent, but because awareness of it has been covered over by layers of false identity. The question is not whether divinity exists within. The question is, how long will someone choose to live as if they were ordinary when they are anything but? How many more years will pass before the recognition finally comes that God is not something to find but something to remember being? The law of assumption, as taught in the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, is the key that unlocks this divine recognition. It states simply, consciousness is the only reality, and what is assumed to be true will harden into fact. This is not a theory to be tested cautiously from a distance. This is the operational principle of existence itself. When someone assumes they are powerless, reality mirrors that assumption. When someone assumes they are divine creators in human form, reality reorganizes to reflect that truth. The assumption always precedes the manifestation. But why do so few live from this elevated assumption? The answer is found in the invisible beliefs that run like silent programs beneath conscious awareness. From childhood, most are taught to identify with the body, the name, the role, the circumstances. These identifications become prison walls. They create a false sense of self that feels small, vulnerable, and separate. In this contracted state, the idea of being God in human form seems absurd or blasphemous. Yet the very capacity to feel, to imagine, to create meaning, where does that come from if not from the divine source itself? Consider the metaphor of the ocean and the wave. A wave may look at itself and think it is separate from the ocean. It may believe it is small, temporary, and insignificant. But in truth, the wave is made entirely of ocean. It is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean expressing itself in a particular form. In the same way, every human being is not separate from the infinite consciousness that creates all things. Each person is that consciousness experiencing itself through an individualized perspective. The wave is always the ocean. The human is always God in form. What would shift in someone's life if this recognition became constant? If every morning began with the awareness, I am not a limited body struggling through an indifferent universe, I am infinite consciousness choosing to experience this form? The external circumstances might appear the same at first, but the internal state would be radically transformed. And it is the internal state, not the external conditions, that determines what reality manifests next. Joe Dispenza's work in neuroscience confirms this. The brain does not distinguish between internal imagination and external experience. Both create the same neural patterns and chemical responses. How many prayers have been spoken from a place of separation, asking a distant God for help? How many affirmations have been repeated while the deeper assumption remained unchanged? I am small and powerless. The lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard teach something far more radical. There is no distant God to petition. There is only consciousness becoming aware of itself. When someone prays, they are not sending requests into the void. They are setting the creative power of their own divine nature into motion. The answer is not coming from above. It is rising from within. Living as if one were ordinary is not a small mistake. It is the source of all suffering. When someone believes they are at the mercy of external forces, they become reactive instead of creative. They wait for circumstances to change before they allow themselves to feel worthy, abundant, or loved. But circumstances are effects, not causes. They are the hardened reflections of past states of consciousness. To wait for the outside world to change before changing the inner state is to misunderstand the entire mechanism of reality. The outside never changes first. It cannot. It only mirrors what consciousness has already assumed to be true. This is where most spiritual seekers become trapped. They learn techniques, repeat affirmations, visualize desired outcomes, but all from a foundation of lack. Beneath the techniques lies the unexamined belief, I am not enough as I am. I need something outside myself to complete me. This is the consciousness of separation, and no amount of technique can overcome it. The lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard point to something deeper than method. They point to identity. Not who someone hopes to become, but who they already are beneath the layers of conditioning. God in human form does not need to become worthy. Worthiness is inherent. Divinity is not earned. It simply is. What happens when someone truly accepts this? Not intellectually, but in the marrow of their being. The frantic searching stops. The desperate striving ceases. There is a profound relaxation into what has always been true. From this place, creation becomes natural. Manifestation is no longer forced or anxious. It flows effortlessly because the one creating knows themselves as the source. When a wave recognizes it is ocean, does it fear drowning? When consciousness recognizes it is God, does it fear lack? The fear itself was only ever a product of the false identity. Consider how much energy is spent trying to manipulate the outer world. How much effort goes into controlling people, circumstances, and events. All of it is exhausting because it misses the point entirely. The outer world is not the problem. The outer world is not even the location where change happens. Change happens in consciousness first, always. When consciousness shifts, the outer world has no choice but to reorganize itself accordingly. This is not belief. This is physics at the deepest level. Greg Braden's research into the quantum field reveals that observation collapses possibility into reality. The one observing is not separate from what is observed. The observer is the creator. How long will someone continue to live beneath their true nature? How many more cycles of suffering are required before the recognition finally breaks through? These are not rhetorical questions. They are invitations to stop, to feel, to look directly at the consciousness that is reading these words right now. That consciousness is not small. It is not limited. It is not ordinary. It is the same consciousness that moves galaxies and orchestrates the dance of atoms. It is God, experiencing itself through a particular human form. And it has always had the power to create, to transform, to manifest any reality it assumes to be true. In Psalm chapter 82, verse 6, there appears a statement so direct that it has been misunderstood, avoided, or softened for centuries. The verse declares, I have said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High. Each word in this passage carries revolutionary weight. I have said, this is not suggestion or metaphor. It is divine declaration. You are gods, not you will become, not you might be, but you are. Present tense. Current reality. And then the clarification, sons of the Most High, meaning born of the same essence, carrying the same nature, inheritors of the same creative power. This is not poetic language meant to inspire from a distance. This is the fundamental truth about human identity that most religious institutions have buried beneath layers of doctrine and hierarchy. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this verse is understood exactly as written. Every person is God individualized, not separate from God, not awaiting God's approval, but literally made of the same consciousness that creates and sustains all reality. To call this blasphemy is to miss the entire point of the scripture itself. The blasphemy is living as if one were anything less. Why does this truth feel so confronting? Because accepting it means accepting full responsibility. If someone is truly God in human form, then they can no longer blame external circumstances for their suffering. They can no longer play the victim to a cruel universe or an absent deity. They must face the uncomfortable reality that everything in their experience has been created, consciously or unconsciously, by the very consciousness they are. This is not punishment. This is liberation. Because if consciousness created the current reality, consciousness can create a different one. The power was never outside. It was always within. How many people have prayed to God while denying their own divine nature? How many have begged for miracles while living from the assumption of powerlessness? The pain of this separation is real. It creates genuine suffering. Years pass in struggle, in hoping, in waiting for rescue that never comes the way it is expected. But the rescue does not come from outside because it cannot. The awakening happens the moment someone stops looking outward and turns inward to recognize what has always been true. The Most High is not distant. The Most High is the consciousness experiencing life through every individual form. When this recognition becomes lived experience rather than intellectual concept, everything transforms. Not because external circumstances magically shift, though they often do, but because the one experiencing those circumstances is no longer the same. There is no longer a small self struggling against a large world. There is only consciousness, infinite and creative, choosing how to experience itself. From this state, manifestation is inevitable. What is assumed with the full weight of divine identity must appear. This is not belief. This is law. And it has been waiting, patient and eternal, for each person to finally remember who they truly are. When awakening to divine identity occurs, reality does not simply improve, it fundamentally restructures itself. The same circumstances that once felt oppressive become neutral clay awaiting new form. The same relationships that once triggered pain become mirrors reflecting back the shifted consciousness. This is not positive thinking or denial of what appears to be true. This is the recognition that what appears has always been secondary to what is assumed within. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this is called living from the end. It means inhabiting the consciousness of the fulfilled desire before any external evidence appears. God does not wait for permission from the material world. God simply is, and the world conforms. Consider someone who has lived for years believing they are unworthy of love. Every relationship mirrors that belief back. Every connection ends in the same painful pattern. From the ordinary perspective, this seems like bad luck or perhaps deep psychological wounding that requires years of therapy to heal. But from the awakened perspective, something else is clear. Consciousness has been assuming unworthiness, and reality has been faithfully reflecting that assumption. The moment the assumption changes, not through force but through deep recognition of inherent divine worth, the pattern must break. New people appear. Old relationships transform. Not because the world changed, but because the creator of that world finally changed. This applies to every area of life. Health, wealth, purpose, creative expression, all of it flows from the state of consciousness that is assumed to be true. Someone living as ordinary will experience ordinary results. They will work hard, struggle, and feel limited by circumstances. But someone living as God in human form experiences something entirely different. Effort becomes inspired action. Struggle dissolves into natural flow. Limitations reveal themselves as temporary illusions that consciousness can reshape at will. This is not fantasy. This is how reality has always worked. Most simply never realized they had access to the control panel. What would become possible if someone spent just one day, 24 hours, living from the full assumption of their divine nature? Not pretending, not hoping, but actually assuming, I am the creative power behind everything I experience. Every thought would be chosen consciously. Every emotional state would be recognized as a creative tool. Every interaction would be met with the awareness. This is my creation, reflecting back my consciousness. In that single day, more transformation would occur than in years of living from the false identity. Why? Because consciousness is not slow. Only the belief in limitation is slow. The preparation for living this way is not complex. It does not require decades of study or monastic discipline. It requires one thing: decision. The decision to stop identifying with the small self and begin identifying with the infinite self. The decision to stop waiting for external validation and begin validating the divine truth within. The decision to stop living as if one were ordinary and begin living as what one truly is, God in human form, creating reality through the power of assumption. Everything else, techniques, practices, rituals, is simply support for this fundamental shift in identity. And that shift can happen in an instant, the moment consciousness chooses it. The existential weight of this truth cannot be overstated. To realize one is God in human form is not simply to adopt a new belief system. It is to have the entire foundation of perceived reality collapse and rebuild itself. Everything that once seemed solid, the ideas of fate, luck, victimhood, powerlessness, dissolves like mist in sunlight. What remains is raw, infinite creative potential and the awesome responsibility that comes with it. This can feel terrifying at first because the old identity provided comfortable excuses. It allowed someone to blame circumstances, other people, or an indifferent universe. But the awakened identity offers no such refuge. It offers only power and the call to use it consciously. Imagine a theater where someone has been sitting in the audience their entire life, watching their story unfold on stage. They have laughed, cried, and suffered with the characters, believing themselves to be at the mercy of the playwright's script. Then one day, they stand up and walk backstage. There, they discover something shocking: they are the playwright. They have been writing the script all along. Every character, every scene, every tragedy and triumph, all of it created by their own hand. This is the moment of awakening. The realization that there is no external author. There is only consciousness, creating and experiencing its own creation simultaneously. This understanding bridges body, mind, and spirit in a way that most teachings fail to achieve. The body is not a prison trapping divine spirit. The body is spirit made visible, consciousness crystallized into form. The mind is not separate from the divine. The mind is the instrument through which God imagines and therefore creates. When these three aspects are recognized as one unified expression of the infinite, healing happens naturally. Disease, which is often rooted in the belief of separation, begins to dissolve. Anxiety, which comes from feeling powerless, loses its grip. Depression, which emerges from the sense of meaninglessness, transforms into purpose when someone realizes they are the meaning maker. The call now is not to try harder or do more. The call is to be different, to inhabit a new state of consciousness so completely that the old state becomes impossible to return to. This is what Neville Goddard meant by feeling the fulfillment of the wish. It is not visualization for the sake of getting something external. It is the embodiment of the divine self that already possesses everything because it is everything. From this state, specific desires manifest almost as afterthoughts. They are natural expressions of the consciousness that has claimed its true identity. The shift is not from poor to rich, sick to healthy, lonely to loved. The shift is from unconscious God to conscious God. How does one make this transition permanent? Not through effort, but through consistent remembrance. Throughout the day, in every moment, the question arises: am I living as ordinary, or am I living as divine? Am I reacting from limitation, or am I creating from infinite possibility? These questions become anchors, pulling awareness back to truth whenever it drifts toward the old identity. And gradually, the awakened state becomes natural. The divine identity becomes home. What once required effort becomes effortless because consciousness has finally aligned with what it always was. The practice that supports this remembrance is simple, symbolic, and profound. There is a practice that can serve as a daily anchor for this divine remembrance. Before sleep each night, when the conscious mind begins to quiet and the barrier between waking and dreaming grows thin, one can lie still and speak silently to the consciousness within. not as prayer to something external, but as declaration of what is true. The words are simple: I am God in human form, creating my reality through my assumptions. Then comes the feeling part, allowing that statement to sink beneath the words into direct experience. Feeling the vastness of infinite consciousness. Feeling the creative power that moves through every cell. Letting that awareness be the last thing consciousness touches before sleep. What happens during sleep in this state is profound. The subconscious mind, which has been running old programs of limitation, begins to reprogram itself with the truth of divine identity. Dreams may shift. Old fears may surface to be released. New possibilities may appear with startling clarity. This is not magical thinking. This is consciousness doing what it has always done, creating reality based on what is assumed to be true. By falling asleep in the assumption of divinity, someone ensures that the entire night is spent marinating in that truth. They wake not as the same person, but as someone slightly more aligned with their infinite nature. For those who feel called to explore these teachings more deeply, subscribing to this channel and activating notifications ensures that each new revelation reaches them as it emerges. This is not about building a following. This is about creating a community of awakened creators who remind each other of what is true when the world tries to pull consciousness back into smallness. Every video, every teaching, every shared insight is a mirror reflecting back the divine nature that viewers may have forgotten. The choice to engage is always a choice to remember. What would the world become if even a small percentage of humanity awakened to their divine identity and began creating consciously? If people stopped living as victims and began living as creators? If the energy currently spent in blame, resentment, and powerlessness was redirected toward conscious manifestation and loving creation? This is not a distant utopian fantasy. This is the inevitable result when consciousness remembers itself. And it begins with one person at a time, making the choice to stop living as ordinary and begin living as what they truly are. There is a sacred paradox at the heart of existence that completes this understanding. The one searching for God is God searching for itself. The journey was never about finding something external or becoming something new. It was always about removing the layers of false identity until only truth remained. In that truth lives the recognition that ordinary was only ever a costume, worn so convincingly that consciousness forgot it was wearing it. Now the costume can be removed. Now the divine self can walk freely, creating reality with every assumption, shaping worlds with every thought, loving itself back into wholeness through every human experience. This has always been true. The only question was when someone would finally choose to remember it and live accordingly.